Beyond the gleaming spiral arms of the Milky Way, the sleek Zorgax warships prowled the void, seeking any signs of their hated foe, the humans. For generations, the two species had clashed in a bitter struggle for dominance, their battles illuminating the cold depths of space with flashes of laser fire and the silent explosions of ruptured hulls. Captain Crux stood on the bridge of his scout ship, the Zorgaxthal, his reptilian eyes narrowed as he surveyed the star-speckled expanse before him. He was a veteran of countless engagements, his scaled hide bearing the scars of close combat and his mind sharpened by decades of strategy and warfare. To Crux and his kind, honor was everything, and the humans represented the ultimate challenge to their martial prowess. Suddenly, a shrill alarm pierced the tense silence of the bridge. "Captain," one of the Zorgax crew members called out. "Sensors have detected a damaged human vessel, designation Argosy, in a nearby sector. They appear to be launching escape pods." Crux's lips curled into a predatory grin. The humans were running, as they always did when faced with superior Zorgax might. But this time, perhaps they could be caught. His mind raced with possibilities, the intelligence they could gather, the prisoners they could take, the blow they could strike against their most hated adversary. "Set a course to intercept those pods," Crux commanded, his voice a rasping hiss. "Prepare the tractor beams and ready the boarding parties. I want those humans alive." The Zorgaxthal surged forward, its engines flaring with pale light as it closed in on its prey. The human ship grew larger on the view screens, trailing sparks and vapor from gaping wounds in its hull. Crux felt a surge of satisfaction at the sight. The humans were weak, their technology inferior, their resolve lacking. This would be a glorious day for the Zorgax. As they approached the tumbling escape pods, Crux leaned forward in his command chair, his claws tapping impatiently on the armrests. His crew worked with efficient precision, locking the tractor beams onto the nearest pod and drawing it into the Zorgaxthal's hold. The others would soon follow, and then the true work would begin. But even as Crux savored the anticipation of the coming interrogations and the secrets they would surely yield, a small flicker of unease passed through his mind. There were stories, whispered among the Zorgax, of the terrible fury that could be unleashed by the humans when they were pushed too far. Tales of entire worlds laid waste, of Zorgax fleets shattered and broken before the onslaught of human vengeance. Crux shook off these thoughts with a growl. They were just stories, nothing more. The humans were weak, and he would prove it once again. As the first pod was hauled aboard, and his crew prepared to breach its hatch, Crux rose from his seat and strode toward the hold, determined to face the pitiful creatures within and show them the true might of the Zorgax Empire. Little did he know that within that pod, huddled in terror amid the sparking wreckage, were 3 innocents who would change the course of the war and the fate of both species forever. Lena, Max, and Tara, 3 human children, torn from the safety of their home and thrust into a galaxy of danger and chaos. Their courage, their resilience, and their very existence would challenge everything Crux thought he knew about his enemy. And so, with the screech of metal on metal and the hiss of atmosphere, the hatch of the escape pod began to open, and the story that would reshape the cosmos began to unfold. The hatch of the escape pod hissed open, and the Zorgax boarding party leveled their plasma rifles at the opening, ready to confront the human warriors they were certain lurked within. But as the smoke cleared and their eyes adjusted to the dim interior, they found not hardened soldiers or desperate fighters, but something altogether unexpected. Huddled together in the cramped confines of the pod were 3 small, terrified figures. Children, by the looks of them, 2 girls and a boy. The eldest, a girl of perhaps 12 Earth years, held the others close, her eyes wide with fear, but also flickering with a determined light. The younger 2, a boy and a girl, clung to her, their faces streaked with tears and their small bodies shaking. For a moment, the Zorgax stood frozen, their weapons lowering in shock. This was not what they had expected. Not at all. Captain Crux pushed his way to the front, his eyes widening as he took in the sight before him. His mind reeled. Human children. Here. How was this possible? And then, like a cold blade sliding into his gut, the realization hit him. The stories. The whispered tales of the terrible wrath of the humans when their young were threatened. The warnings that even the most hardened Zorgax warriors spoke of with dread. You took human children, Crux whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. He rounded on his crew, his eyes blazing with a fear they had never seen in their captain before. Do you have a death wish? The crew stood stunned, the gravity of their error slowly sinking in. They had heard the stories too, but like Crux, they had dismissed them as mere legends, the exaggerated tales of a primitive species. Now, faced with the reality of 3 small innocent lives in their grasp, they began to understand the depths of their mistake. Crux knew he had to act fast. Every moment the children remained in Zorgax's custody was a moment that brought them closer to annihilation. He had to return them, and quickly, before the humans realized what had happened. Prepare a comfortable quarters for the children, Crux snapped at his crew. Give them food, water, anything they need, but do not harm them. Not a single hair on their heads, do you understand? The crew nodded, scrambling to obey. They knew the stakes now, and they knew their very lives depended on the safety of these tiny, fragile creatures. As the children were gently escorted from the pod, the oldest girl met Crux's gaze. In her eyes, he saw not just fear, but defiance, a strength that belied her tender years. I'm Lena, she said, her voice small but steady. This is Max and Tara. We won't let you hurt us. Crux felt a shiver run down his spine. Even now, in the face of an unknown fate at the hands of an alien race, this child had the courage to stand tall. It was a courage he had never encountered before, not in all his years of war and conquest. You will not be harmed, Crux said, his voice softening. I swear it, on my honor as a Zorgax. You will be returned to your people, safe and unarmed. Lena held his gaze a moment longer, searching for the truth in his words. Then, slowly, she nodded. As the children were led away, Crux turned to his crew. Send a message to the High Command, he said, his voice grim. Tell them what has happened, and pray to the gods of war that they can guide us through this crisis. For Crux knew that the fate of not just these children, but of the entire Zorgax species now hung in the balance. And the wrath of the humans, once unleashed, would be a force unlike any the galaxy had ever known. Lena, Max, and Tara found themselves in a strange new world aboard the Zorgax ship. The quarters they had been given were sparse but comfortable, with soft, spongy beds that molded to their bodies and a table that seemed to grow right out of the floor. Food and drink appeared as if by magic, strange, colorful cubes and spheres that tasted of fruit and honey and left them feeling full and satisfied. But even as they marveled at the wonders around them, the children couldn't shake the fear that gripped their hearts. They were alone, lost in the depths of space, at the mercy of an alien race they had been taught to fear and hate. Lena did her best to comfort her younger siblings, holding them close and whispering soothing words. But inside she was just as scared as they were. She couldn't understand why the Zorgax were treating them so well, why they seemed so afraid of harming them. It went against everything she had ever heard about the ruthless, savage aliens. As the hours ticked by, Lena's mind raced with questions and worries. What would happen to them? Would they ever see their parents again? And why did the Zorgax captain, the one called Crux, look at them with such fear and reverence? Little did Lena know that across the ship, Crux was grappling with the same questions. He paced the bridge, his mind whirling with the implications of what had happened. The human children were not just valuable prisoners. They were a ticking time bomb, a threat that could bring the full might of the human fleet down upon them at any moment. Crux had sent his message to the High Command, but he knew that their response would be slow in coming. The Zorgax were a proud species, not prone to rash decisions or hasty actions. They would deliberate, weigh the options, Consider the risks. And all the while, the children would remain aboard the ship, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. As he pondered his next move, Crux found his thoughts turning to the oldest child, the girl called Lena. There was something about her, a strength and resilience that belied her tender years. She had faced him without fear, even in the midst of her own terror. It was a quality he had never seen in a human before. Almost without realizing it, Crux found himself making his way to the children's quarters. He needed to see them, to talk to them. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to navigate this crisis without bringing destruction down upon his people. As he entered the room, the children looked up, their eyes wide with surprise and trepidation. Crux held up his hands, palms outward in a gesture of peace. "I mean you no harm," he said, his voice soft and low. "I know you are scared and confused, but I promise you, I will do everything in my power to see you safely return to your people." Lena stood, putting herself between Crux and her siblings. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you doing this? Why do you care what happens to us?" Crux hesitated, searching for the words. How could he explain the complex history between their species, the weight of the stories and legends that had shaped his people's fears? "There are stories," he said at last. "Tales of what happens when human children are harmed. Tales of the terrible vengeance that follows. We Zorgax, we have learned to fear that vengeance, above all else." Lena's eyes widened, a flicker of understanding dawning on her face. "You're afraid of us," she whispered. "Afraid of what our people will do." Crux nodded, his shoulders slumping. "Yes," he said. "And that fear may be the only thing that can save us all." And so, in the quiet of the ship, an unlikely understanding began to grow between captor and captive. A fragile bond, forged in the crucible of fear and desperation, that might just hold the key to peace between their peoples. But the road ahead would be long and treacherous, and the shadow of war still loomed large over them all. News of the captured human children spread through the Zorgax fleet like wildfire, sparking reactions of disbelief, horror, and outright panic. The mere thought of having human young in their custody was enough to send even the most battle-hardened warriors into a frenzy of fear and anxiety. In the grand halls of the Zorgax High Command, the leaders of the species gathered in emergency session, their normally stoic faces etched with lines of worry and concern. They had received Crux's message, and the implications were staggering. "This is a disaster," one of the commanders growled, slamming his fist on the table. "If the humans find out we have their children, they will stop at nothing to destroy us. We must return them immediately," another chimed in, her voice trembling slightly. "Every moment they remain in our custody is a moment we inch closer to our own annihilation." The debate raged on, with each leader offering their own solution, their own plan for mitigating the damage. But one thing was clear. The Zorgax, for all their advanced technology and military might, were gripped by a fear that bordered on superstition when it came to human children. The stories were deeply ingrained in their culture, passed down from generation to generation. Tales of entire Zorgax fleets wiped out in an instant, of planets reduced to cinders, all because of a single human child taken or harmed. No one knew if the stories were true, but no one was willing to take the risk of finding out. As the High Command deliberated, Crux found himself spending more and more time with the children. He told himself it was to keep them calm, to ensure their cooperation. But deep down, he knew there was more to it than that. Lena, in particular, had a way of getting under his skin. She was curious, always asking questions about his species, his culture, his way of life. And despite himself, Crux found himself answering, sharing stories and insights he had never shared with anyone before. "Why do you fight us?" Lena asked one day, her eyes wide and searching. "What did we ever do to you?" Crux hesitated, searching for the words. "It's complicated," he said at last. "There is a long history of conflict between our peoples, stretching back generations. We have fought for resources, for territory, for dominance. But He trailed off, his gaze distant. But maybe at the heart of it all, we fight because we are afraid. Afraid of what we don't understand, of what we can't control. And nothing terrifies us more than the thought of human retribution, of the fury that would be unleashed if we ever harmed one of your young. Lena was silent for a moment, considering his words. "But don't you see?" she said at last. "That fear, that terror, it's what's keeping this war going. If we could just learn to understand each other, to trust each other, maybe we could find a way to end it." Crux looked at her, amazed by her wisdom, her insight. Here was a child, barely a fraction of his age, and yet she seemed to grasp the heart of the conflict in a way that eluded even the wisest of his kind. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. "Maybe understanding is the key, but it will not be easy. There is so much history, so much pain and anger on both sides." Lena nodded, her face set with determination. "I know," she said, "but we have to try, for the sake of both our peoples." And so, as the Zorgak ship raced towards the human outpost, carrying its precious cargo and the hopes of two species, a new understanding began to take root. An understanding that could, perhaps, bridge the gulf between two ancient enemies and bring an end to the cycle of fear and violence that had consumed them for so long. But the path ahead was fraught with danger, and the specter of war still loomed large. It would take more than the wisdom of a child to bring peace to the galaxy. It would take courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to confront the darkness that lurked in the hearts of both human and Zorgaks alike. As the Zorgak ship hurtled through the void, drawing ever closer to the human outpost, Crux found himself spending more and more time with the children, particularly Lena. There was a bond forming between them, a connection that transcended the barriers of species and culture. Lena, for her part, was fascinated by the Zorgaks' way of life. She peppered Crux with questions about their history, their customs, their beliefs, and Crux, to his own surprise, found himself opening up to her in ways he never had with anyone before. One day, as they sat together in the children's quarters, Lena asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the beginning. "Crux," she said softly, "why are your people so afraid of us? What happened in the past that made you so terrified of harming human children?" Crux was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. Then, with a heavy sigh, he began to speak. "It was long ago," he said, his voice low and somber. "Before I was born, before my parents were born. Our species were at war as we are now. But back then, the Zorgaks were winning. We had pushed the humans back to their last strongholds, and victory seemed certain." He paused, his gaze falling to the floor. But then, in a desperate move, the humans did something unexpected. They sent a ship, much like the one you were on, filled with their children. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. And they broadcast a message across the galaxy, to every Zorgak ship and outpost. Lena leaned forward, her eyes wide. What did the message say? Crux's voice was barely a whisper. It said, "We send you our children, the future of our species. If you truly believe in your cause, if you truly think us evil, then destroy them. But know that if you do, there will be no mercy, no forgiveness. We will hunt you to the ends of the universe, and we will not stop until every last Zorgax is wiped from existence." Lena was silent, her face pale. Crux continued, his voice trembling slightly. The Zorgak's high command, in their arrogance, did not believe the threat. They ordered the ship destroyed, the children killed. And that was the beginning of the end. He looked up, his eyes haunted. The humans were true to their word. They came at us with a fury unlike anything we had ever seen. Their ships seemed to appear out of nowhere, their weapons tearing through our defenses like paper. They showed no mercy, no quarter. They slaughtered us by the millions, until barely a fraction of our species remained. Lena was crying now, tears streaking her cheeks. That's horrible," she whispered. "I had no idea." Crux nodded, his own eyes glistening. "It was a lesson we learned at a terrible cost. and one we have never forgotten. From that day forward, the very idea of harming a human child has been the greatest taboo in our culture, the one line we dare not cross. Lena reached out, taking Crux's hand in her own. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, "for what happened to your people, for the pain and loss you suffered." Crux squeezed her hand, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Thank you, Lena. Your compassion, your understanding, it gives me hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, our peoples can find a way to end this cycle of violence and hate." And so, as the ship raced onwards, a new understanding blossomed between human and Zorgax, a fragile bond, born of shared pain and the desire for something better. It was a small thing, a flicker of light in the darkness of space. But sometimes, the smallest of lights can illuminate the path to peace, and as Lena and Crux looked to the stars, they dared to dream of a future where their peoples could stand together, united by the bonds of friendship and trust. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in generations, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance, however slim, for a new beginning. As the Zorgax ship approached the human outpost, the tension on board was palpable. The crew worked frantically to prepare for any eventuality, their eyes glued to the sensor screens, their claws hovering over the weapon controls. Crux stood on the bridge, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. He knew that the fate of his species, and perhaps the fate of the entire galaxy, rested on the success of this mission. Beside him, Lena watched the view screen with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had come to trust Crux, to believe in his sincerity and his desire for peace, but she knew that not all humans would be so understanding, so willing to forgive. As they drew closer to the outpost, the sensor screen suddenly lit up with a flurry of activity. A massive human fleet had gathered around the station, their ships bristling with weapons and shields. The Zorgax crew let out a collective gasp of fear and despair. They were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. If the humans chose to attack, they would be annihilated in seconds. But Crux remained calm, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Open a channel," he said, his voice steady. "Broadcast on all frequencies." The communications officer complied, his claws shaking slightly as he activated the transmission. Crux took a deep breath, then began to speak. "Attention, human fleet. This is Captain Crux of the Zorgax ship Zorgaxthal. We come in peace, bearing a precious cargo, 3 of your children, taken by mistake during a recent battle." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We deeply regret this error, and we wish to return the children to you unharmed. We ask only for the opportunity to do so peacefully, without violence or retribution." There was a long, tense silence. Then, a human voice crackled over the speakers. "Zorgax ship, this is Admiral Ivanov of the human fleet. We have received your transmission and are standing by. But know this, if any harm has come to those children, there will be no mercy. We will hunt you to the ends of the universe." Crux closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the Admiral's words settling on his shoulders. "I understand, Admiral, and I give you my word, on my honor as a Zorgax, that the children are safe and unharmed." He turned to Lena, his eyes softening. "It's time," he said gently. "Are you ready?" Lena nodded, her face pale but determined. "I'm ready." Together, they'd made their way to the airlock, where Max and Terra were waiting, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Crux knelt before them, his voice gentle. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. "I'm going to take you back to your people now. But I want you to remember something. Not all Zorgax are evil. Some of us, like me, want peace, want to end this war. And it's because of you, because of your bravery and your kindness, that we have a chance to do that." Max and Terra nodded, tears streaming down their faces. Lena hugged them close, whispering words of comfort and encouragement. Then, with a final nod to Crux, she took her siblings by the hand and stepped into the airlock. The door hissed shut behind them. And for a moment, Crux felt a pang of loss, of sadness. But he pushed it aside, steeling himself for what was to come. He had a duty to perform, a wrong to right, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. As the airlock cycled and the children prepared to step out into the waiting arms of their people, Crux could only hope that their brief time together had planted a seed of understanding, of empathy, of the possibility of peace. For in the end, it was not the weapons or the ships or the armies that would decide the fate of the galaxy. It was the hearts and minds of those who inhabited it, the courage to reach out, to find common ground, to build bridges instead of walls. And as the airlock doors opened and the children took their first steps towards home, Crux knew that, whatever the future held, he had been a part of something greater than himself. Something that just might change the course of history. As the airlock doors hissed open, revealing the cavernous hangar bay of the human outpost, Lena, Max, and Tara found themselves blinking in the sudden brightness. After the dimly lit confines of the Zorgak ship, the sheer scale and bustle of the human facility was almost overwhelming. A phalanx of armed soldiers stood at the ready, their weapons trained on the airlock. But as the children stepped forward, their hands raised in a gesture of peace, the soldiers lowered their guns, their faces registering shock and disbelief. From the center of the formation, a tall, imposing figure strode forward. It was Admiral Ivanov, his face lined with worry and tension. He had been preparing for battle, steeling himself for the worst. But nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him now. "Stand down," he barked to his soldiers, his voice echoing through the hangar. Then, more softly, he addressed the children. "Are you all right? Are you hurt?" Lena shook her head, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "We're fine, Admiral. Thanks to Captain Crux." Ivanov's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Captain Crux, the Zorgak's commander." Lena nodded. "He protected us, kept us safe. He wants peace, Admiral. He wants to end this war." Ivanov was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching Lena's face. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I want to hear everything," he said softly. "Every detail." And so, as the soldiers escorted them to the safety of the outpost's inner sanctum, Lena began to tell their story. She spoke of the terror of the initial capture, of the fear and uncertainty that had gripped her heart. But she also spoke of Crux's kindness, his protection, the way he had opened up to her about the tragic history of their peoples. As Ivanov listened, his face grew thoughtful, his eyes distant. He had fought the Zorgaks for decades, had lost friends and comrades to their weapons. But never, in all that time, had he considered the possibility that they, too, might be motivated by fear, by the scars of the past. "You've given me a lot to think about," he said at last, his voice heavy with emotion. "If what you say is true, if there are those among the Zorgaks who desire peace, then maybe, just maybe, we have a chance to end this conflict once and for all." Lena's heart leaped at his words, a surge of hope and excitement coursing through her. "You mean it," she whispered. "You'll give peace a chance." Ivanov nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I'll do more than that," he said softly. "I'll reach out to the Zorgak's high command, invite them to the negotiating table. It won't be easy, and there will be those on both sides who resist. But if we don't try, if we don't take this chance, then what is all this fighting for?" Tears sprang to Lena's eyes, and she threw her arms around Ivanov's neck, hugging him tight. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing." And as word spread through the outpost, as the soldiers and civilians alike marveled at the bravery of the three children who had changed the course of history, a new feeling began to take hold, a feeling of hope, of possibility, of a future where humans and Zorgaks could live side by side in peace. It was a fragile thing, this hope. It would need to be nurtured, protected, guided by wise hands and compassionate hearts. But it was there, a flicker of light in the darkness, a promise of a better tomorrow. And as Lena looked out at the stars, she knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage and determination. For she had seen the power of understanding, the strength that comes from reaching out to those we fear. And she knew that together, there was nothing they could not achieve. The news of the children's safe return and the Zorgax's surprising gesture of peace spread like wildfire through both the human and Zorgax fleets. At first, there was disbelief, confusion, even anger on both sides. Many humans were skeptical, convinced that the Zorgax's overtures were nothing more than a trick, a ploy to lull them into a false sense of security. And among the Zorgax, there were those who saw Crux's actions as a betrayal, a sign of weakness in the face of the enemy. But as the details of the children's story emerge, as the true depth of Crux's compassion and the children's bravery became clear, something began to shift. On the human side, there was a growing sense of hope, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, peace was possible. And among the Zorgax, there was a newfound respect for Crux, a recognition of the courage it had taken to break the cycle of fear and hatred. In the days and weeks that followed, tentative contacts were made, diplomatic channels opened. It was a slow process, fraught with mistrust and misunderstanding. But gradually, step by step, the two sides began to come together. Lena, Max, and Terra found themselves at the center of this process, their story a powerful symbol of the potential for change. They were hailed as heroes, as ambassadors of a new era of peace and understanding. But for Lena, the true hero was Crux. She knew that without his bravery, his willingness to look beyond the prejudices of his people, none of this would have been possible. And so, as the negotiations progressed and the prospects for peace grew stronger, she made a request of the human leadership. She wanted to see Crux again, to thank him in person for all he had done. At first, there was resistance, fear that such a meeting could be dangerous. But Lena was insistent, and in the end, her request was granted. And so, in a neutral location far from the fleets and the outposts, Lena and Crux met once more. It was a moment charged with emotion, with the weight of all that had happened between them. "I wanted to thank you," Lena said softly, her eyes shining with tears. "For what you did, for the risk you took. You changed everything." Crux shook his head, his own eyes glistening. "No, Lena. It was you. Your courage, your compassion. You showed me that there was another way, a path beyond fear and hate." They talked for hours, sharing their hopes and dreams for the future. And as they parted, they knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Not as human and Zorgax, but as friends, as allies in the cause of peace. In the years that followed, the process of reconciliation continued. There were setbacks, moments of tension and mistrust. But slowly, steadily, the walls between the two peoples began to crumble. Joint projects were launched, cultural exchanges initiated. Human and Zorgax children learned side by side in schools, while scientists and engineers worked together to solve the great challenges facing the galaxy. And at the center of it all were Lena, Max, and Terra. They grew into adulthood as symbols of hope, as living embodiments of the power of understanding and compassion. Their story was told and retold, a reminder of the fragility of peace and the importance of nurturing it. Looking back, Lena knew that the path they had chosen had not been an easy one. But as she looked out at a galaxy transformed, at the bonds of friendship and trust that now united human and Zorgax, she knew that it had been worth it. For in the end, it was not the weapons or the ships or the armies that had brought peace. It was the courage to see beyond difference, to reach out to the other in a spirit of empathy and respect. And as Lena stood hand in hand with Crux, gazing up at the stars that had once been the backdrop of war, she knew that, as long as that spirit endured, there was no limit to what they could achieve. The future was theirs to shape, a canvas upon which to paint a new and brighter tomorrow. And together, step by step, they would build a galaxy of peace, a legacy that would endure for generations to come.